Hello and welcome to my online channel where I talk about movies and culture and stuff. Today is a big video essay about something that I've been thinking about and talking about with my community for a little bit, and just like things that I've noticed that no one else really seems to have talked about publicly, which I think is kind of crazy. Today I want to talk about why women are dominating horror right now. First of all, I want to lay a baseline claim before I start building on this. Films made at their time reflect a lot about society that they're made in. It reflects the culture, the attitudes, the traditions of the society that the film is made in. Films don't shape audiences, audiences shape films. And that is actually a researchable fact. Cultural reflection theory is what this is called, and it's the idea that films basically reflect the anxiety, the fear, the needs, the wants of the culture that the film is made in. And this is just widely accepted, and it's something that I think you learn in film school. I didn't go to film school, but I think that you learn this just because it is such a major part of it. For example, writer Siegfried Krauser said, "Films reflect prevailing attitudes rather than attempt to shape them." He argued that cinema acts as an unconscious recorder of national psyches, capturing societal fears and desires even when filmmakers don't intend it to. And that's kind of what I want to get at today about this unconscious thing that's happening. French film critic André Bazin says, "Every film is the result of a social situation." And he believed that films could not be separated from the context in which they were made, as they were shaped by the collective consciousness of the creators and audiences. Film critic Robin Wood said, "The true horror in horror films is a reflection of the horrors of real life." And cinematic philosopher Noel Carroll said, "Horror stories frequently address anxieties that are widespread within the culture at the time of their telling." So I'm not the only one that thinks this. This is like a widely accepted thing. Horror reflects what's going on with people, and it's not this agenda that does it the other way around. It doesn't really make sense. I wanted to discuss this cultural reflection theory because I want to be self-aware that almost all of the movies I'm going to talk about today are written and directed by men, and a lot of writers and directors are men. Today this video is about the greater cultural feelings, and men can channel that just as much as a woman can. And it's not really about separating people into groups, especially considering that tons and tons of men enjoy feminist stuff, literature, movies, TV shows, and they don't feel personally affected by that, like personally offended and targeted by that. My cultural film analysis today is not about separating men and women into groups. It's more about talking about the elephant in the room and what people, men and women, have created in horror in the last 5 years and why. I can't be the only one who's noticed in the past 5 or more years, horror movies have been absolutely dominated by women, women's stories, and feminist theory. It's so many things that we've been exploring in films, whether it's the pressures of womanhood, whether it's the pressures of motherhood, whether it's showcasing violent misogyny, or it's humanizing and making women look very, very brave as they are and not often showcased as that. Here's some of the notable ones that have come out in the last 5 years. We have Relic, Saint Maud, The Invisible Man, Titan X, Pearl Barbarian, Men, The Menu, Longlegs, The Substance, Last Night in Soho, Immaculate, Blink Twice, Love Lies Bleeding, Poor Things, Possessor, Night Bitch, Companion, The First Omen, and a lot more. All of these films explore a specific women issue at least once. SA, domestic violence, religious fundamentalism, cultural pressures to act like your gender. Literally, some of the only box office horrors that didn't touch on a feminist issue at least once were literally The Black Phone, Nosferatu, and Skinamarink. And I haven't even seen The Black Phone. I don't even know for sure. But Nosferatu and Skinamarink didn't really address any kind of feminist theory directly. I would say that Nosferatu, you could argue, does in a huge way, especially because people were talking about the repression of sexuality in the Victorian ages. So even Nosferatu is arguable. That is insane. And if you actually really think, the last few years has been absolutely dominated by showcasing women's stories in a way that's never ever been done before. This phenomena of aggressively feminist media is relatively new. Like, horror has been very progressive historically, but the final girl trope has morphed into this like sexualized kind of eye candy trope to a genuine portrayal of like being very brave, and then like also attacking a lot of the misconceptions we have about womanhood. And it feels like cathartic release when you're watching these movies. A lot of it is like genuinely empowering, and it's an excellent portrayal of the things that nobody really talks about. And even if you can come up with a film that wasn't about feminist themes in the last 5 years, can you ask if they have some kind of male villain, or like they showcase like the violence of toxic masculinity? No. And I'm not saying this is bad or should be changed. I need to say that, because personally, it's been very joyous and very satisfying as someone who experienced extreme fundamentalist religious trauma and who has read a lot of feminist theory. This has been a joyous time for me and all my friends. It's been very, very, very fun. So if this is so great for me, why does it feel so imbalanced? And why am I a little bit scared? I'm terrified by this, and I feel uncomfortable by it in a way that I can't just enjoy Furiosa in the theater. I'm thinking about something that's heavy, heavy, heavy on my mind, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. Where did all the male horror protagonists go? I just find myself asking in my mind, as someone who's enjoyed a lot of horror, and I've watched hundreds of horror movies since I was very young, where is the horror response for men today? And what does that say about our culture and the way we're heading? I'm not saying that men physically have gotten pushed out of horror. I'm saying that the characters and stories have been feminist characters and stories, and there is a void where there used to not be. And people aren't really talking about that. But there is something really interesting here that combines two of my favorite things, which is talking about movies and then also talking about cultural trends and things that I find really interesting. A few weeks ago, I was watching John Carpenter's The Thing. And if you know about that movie, it's the best movie ever made. It's one of my favorites. It's in my top 20. And when I was watching it, I just kept thinking to myself, why is this so satisfying in a way that other male protagonists aren't? I came to the conclusion that it's about an authentic story. And because that's kind of always what it is for me, The Thing feels authentic because it is about solidarity. The men in this situation with an alien fighting for their lives are bound together by circumstance and not by choice, just like we all are. And they're not portrayed as manly because of their brute strength and their macho-ness, but they're portrayed as manly because of their intelligence and their noble sacrifice for humanity, their noble fight. They're literally smart. Like, they are there for a reason. They're researching there. They're empathetic enough to try and save their foreign counterparts. And what's most satisfying about this movie is they're using like their masculine traits for a noble and good cause that is generally empathetic and selfless. You have like your traditional masculine outfits and camaraderie and brotherhood and masculinity, using that for a cause that audiences can get behind. And don't get mad at me, but I literally think The Thing at its essence is about class solidarity and the shared pressures of capitalism and the world. I genuinely do think that. These men are isolated, they're fully dependent on each other for resources and can't survive without each other, and they have a common enemy. That is authentic. It makes a really charming and relatable protagonist that you want to root for. And it's just extremely fun to watch because you want them to win. You understand them in a way that feels timeless and extends across generations. The crowds in which show up for this movie, still, it's like a movie that resonates with a lot of people, and it was made a very long time ago. But The Thing is not the only movie like this that showcases men doing male things in a way that doesn't feel like they're punching down on anybody. In the late 60s through the 80s, we had some really charming and very culturally significant horror movies that came out that were amazing for male protagonists and for men to look at and to feel like cathartic release for. 1968, Night of the Living Dead is famously about mindless consumerism. The main character is very easy to root for, and he is killed by the establishment. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974, which is one of my favorite watches in the world, dredges up blue-collar anxiety and the loss of industrial labor at the time. I also want to do a sidebar here that the remake of this movie is balls. It's trash, and that's kind of a microcosm for what I'm trying to talk about here. It's an enjoyable watch and it's fun to watch, but in no way does it have the cultural impact of the 70s one. In no way. And it should, because we have better effects now. We have more quote-unquote innovation, but why is it worse? Jaws from 1975 famously discusses profit over human life and the working class struggle, and the mayor literally refuses to shut down the beach to protect the local economy. And it's up to a working class shark hunter, Quint, and a scientist to deal with the consequences. I think we all remember the first time we watched Jaws. Alien from 1979 is literally about space truckers. Like, it's about corporate greed and the people feeling expendable at the cost of corporate greed. The Shining from 1980 showcases the pressures of work and fatherhood in economic hardships. And although men are the villain in this one, technically masculinity is the villain, I would say this is different, and it's important because it showcases specifically the effects of the establishment on one father and him trying to annihilate his family because of that. I think that's like a different thing than in Blink Twice versus like men just doing evil things because of a sex drive. Like, I think this is a different thing. Videodrome from 1983 is literally about a TV station owner who is drawn into a world of mind-controlling television signals. This showcases the dehumanizing effects of media, technology, and corporate control. And that is literally one of the most famous movies of all time. It's very, very prevalent in horror communities today. People still talk about it a lot. It's a beautiful movie. It's done very well. It's like, where is our Videodrome of today? And lastly, the example that made me want to make this video was They Live from 1988, being very, very, very clearly about mind control and the struggle of the working class. This one made me want to make this video so badly because I saw in a comment section someone having a They Live profile picture and saying something that was like very pro establishment. And I was just thinking about how they don't really understand the movie. Like, I'm not even saying that because of my opinion, I'm saying that because the creator of the movie says what the movie's about. It's not about opinion. So what do these films have in common? What do these famous, iconic, beautiful films have in common? They're about men in the working class. They're about men in the working class. What was happening during these movies was an amalgamation of a bunch of different things, but specifically in the late 60s and 70s, there was a crisis of masculinity because of job loss, economic hardship, and just shifting power. There was also a lot of growing anxiety and distrust of the government. Does that sound familiar? So horror in the late 60s often portrayed men as powerless workers being disregarded by a huge system or a corporation. And then in the 1980s with Reagan, the rise of consumerism portrayed men as like not just struggling against their own exploitation, but also the overwhelming pressure of technology and advertising. But what is terrifying to me is there is no natural progression of these types of movies into today. That's strange, and it's weird. American historian Herbert Gutman said, "The plight of the white male worker in the industrial era was often about reclaiming a sense of identity and agency in a system that reduced him to mere labor." And what you saw in older horror movies was quite literally a manifestation of this. And they literally feel like better stories because they are better stories. They're authentic stories. And they feel empowering and they feel fun to watch and timeless because they are so authentic. When you're able to see your situation clearly and represented in media, not only do you feel less afraid and confused, but you also feel comforted and like you're part of a community that's working towards something better. But the issue, I think, now is that people aren't understanding their situation. And specifically to me, how could I feel empowered by movies like Immaculate and Maxine if I didn't know what I was experiencing my whole life was religious misogyny? Like, if I didn't know that, it would be really hard to find community there. American sociologist Michael Kimmel said, The loss of economic security, particularly in the Rust Belt, has been a defining issue for white working class men. This economic decline is not simply about a loss of wages, but a loss of status, and the shift from industrial work to service-based economies has undermined their identities. So what you see happening throughout history is a lot of men feeling like their identity has drifted off because it's a moving target and it's hard to pin down. When your identity is based around you being able to provide for your family, when that goes away, you don't have that identity left, and it's scary. And what you were dealing with in these films from the late 60s to the 80s was a representation of crisis of identity with white working class men, and they were dealing with that through film and finding common ground with each other through film. And lots of people can relate to what is happening in these movies because they're about working class struggles inherently, at least to a degree. So people like me fully enjoy them as well. These are not punching down on anybody, they're just community building, really good movies. You're seeing in these movies a struggle for economic survival mixed with an identity crisis and the perception of their own masculinity. These characters are tossing with that, and they're trying to find their identity in a world that is very confusing. Thus, you get movies with a working class hero fighting against something bigger than himself. And he's using his traditionally masculine traits to help his community, whether that is saving them from aliens, saving the global community from aliens, or it's saving his community from like government takedown shit going on. Whatever it is, he's a working class hero. He's using his crisis of identity into something greater than himself. So in theory, if you look at the state of men now, who are obviously going through the exact same thing as they were in the past, we should have 20,000 movies portraying this situation. Men trying to work through this. We should have a plethora of horror movies specifically about what is going on. But we don't. There are none. That is absolutely insane. And that is really scary because with feminist narratives in horror, like Silence of the Lambs for a specific example, and Suspiria, or even Alien Resurrection, they've paved the way into movies like The Substance and Immaculate. Like you see like a gradual progression of feminist theory into something really special, and it always was special, but now it's very, very, very empowering and direct in its messaging. But with these male-centered like anti-establishment films, you don't see the progression. It kind of just fizzles out. Like there are no modern day counterparts to these movies. The conversation has totally ended. And I'm not saying that there's none. Like you can say The Lighthouse and The Ritual are two examples of like movies that kind of are about camaraderie and class struggles and stuff, but they're few and far between. And for the extent of like economic pressure and like identity crises going on with men, there should be so many more than just The Lighthouse. Like I just can't get over how insane that is. And these movies are not huge cultural events like they were in the 70s and 80s. Like when Alien came out, it was a cultural event. There are still like Alien rides to this day. There's no really substitute there for men. There's only really women's cultural events. Like The Substance is a women's cultural life-changing event. Like that movie changed a lot of people's lives. It's huge. So what happened to these like older horror working class heroes? Like where did they go? And I'm asking myself this, and I'm kind of like, what does that mean? Like that they're gone? Like men's horror used to be external threats like monsters or conspiracies or corporate exploitation or something they could physically use masculinity to fight against. And they were fighting against their own oppression, their own battle. And everyone has oppression to a degree. And when that frustration has nowhere to go, it's very scary to me. We talked about before, films are a representation of the culture. This is not a film issue, it's a culture issue. So why have men left horror, and what does that mean for us? Especially, what does that mean for women? My conspiracy theory is that men of the modern day are experiencing an identity crisis to the likes of men from the late 60s to the 80s. Because of the economy and the global shifts happening, But instead of finding community in their shared experiences and challenges, lots of men are led to believe that women and minorities are responsible for this loss of identity and not actually the systems that they're in. And that is why there's not horror for them right now, because they're not in agreement of what is the issue like they used to be. And that is extremely sad to me. When you divide a group like you divide men, and you tell them about a fake enemy and separate them from their core struggle, you create division in our society, not just among men. Especially when men are unfortunately in the power position in a lot of families. So even other women will look to the men in their lives for direction. And that can be dangerous as well. Unfortunately, the way our societies are set up is men are in positions of power almost all of the time. I'd say all the time, just for sake of argument. When the men are unsure of what their issue is with their identity and they're blaming women or blaming minorities, that ends up having other women believe that as well. And you see that happening. From my point of view, I'm saying I see a lot of blaming and division happening in the culture, and people kind of are thinking that if you give someone else more rights, it's taking away your own, when that's not how that works. So in 2025, what do you make horror about if the audience is unsure of what their issue is, or they've been disconnected from their core issues? What do you make the horror about? The answer is you don't. It felt like the audiences of male horror-led films of the late 60s and beyond had a clear class consciousness that gave them purpose and was reflected in their popularity. But what do you make horror about if the audience at its core is pointing the finger in all these different directions, when the spirit of progression has dissipated and the end goal is something really weird and abstract like a nuclear family? I think the answer is radio silence. And that is really sad to me because, first of all, I enjoy movies like The Thing and Videodrome, and it's authentic and enjoyable to watch these movies because men are fighting their own fight, an authentic one, where they're struggling against the unjust pressures of masculinity and class. But second of all, this reflection in our society really scares me because I've seen the physical repercussions of this disorganization of what men's identity issue is and what they think it is versus what it actually is. I'm seeing quite literally my rights and my friends' rights being taken away. That's insane. I don't have any type of answer personally, but knowing that so many women and people before me have been discussing and fighting for a shared idea of progression and freedom is extremely comforting to me because that gives me something to root for. And I don't know what I would do without that. So I think I would feel lost and angry, and maybe I'd blame other people. And I think that's what a lot of men are doing right now, and blaming women specifically. You're seeing a lot of shit go down where there's a lot of division and tension between men and women right now, and people are getting hurt. I've never experienced the level of misogyny and misinformation that I'm getting on my feed now. And that might just be because my algorithm is really clickbaity, or it's gotten worse since I was a teen. But when I open up social media, stuff I don't want to interact with is constantly on my feed, whether that's dieting, or it's podcast bros talking about women's bodies and anatomy and stuff, or it's think pieces on what is the best body type or whatever. It's a lot of men's response to the masculinity crisis has been to look at men who are saying they have their identity all figured out, and they're telling people that the pinnacle of masculinity is to exploit as many people as possible and to not be feminine, and that feminism is taking away men's rights. And if you're not making money, you're a loser. If you don't look a certain way, you're a loser. And I think that the lack of horror for men is not the cause, but it's a really scary symptom of what's going on. I do want to talk about, though, interestingly, where Black stories and Black horror lands throughout all of this, and why it kind of proves my point a bit. I would argue that Black horror is going the same way as women's horror, where the stories are getting progressively more direct and intense because there is a community of shared experience there that is unshakable, just like the feminist stories are. There isn't misdirection at the wrong place in feminism or in racism. Those two communities know the struggle because it's like, it becomes a part of your identity to be watching out for those kind of things. Like Black horror, just like women's horror, is relaying what is actually going on physically in the world, like it always has, where like it feels like white working class men's horror has dissipated and it doesn't show what's going on in the real world anymore, when it probably should, because it would be just as powerful as the Black and women's stories are going. Companion just got released, and that is literally about an AI Smex robot. And that is a genuine thing that's happening. And I'm really sorry if I have to be the one to tell you that, but it's gross and it's actually happening. And it's real. So these audiences know what the struggle is, and there's a common understanding there. And there is power and empowerment in that, in like people watching horror that portrays a collective struggle. Like that is comforting, it's empowering for both of those parties. But I think specifically with men, they've lost touch with their own struggle and their own story. We used to have like a cultural representation of these struggles, and now it's completely radio silence for men's horror. I don't have any of the answers. I guess I just wanted to point out something that I've been thinking about, because unfortunately it is very fascinating the way that our culture is heading. I just wonder how many people wouldn't have fallen into pipelines if they had spaces and communities where they felt like they were getting somewhere, or it felt like supportive, or like a real community that helped their self-esteem, and not like a fake community that says what will help their self-esteem and it's actually just like making the other person money or making their lives worse, to be honest. So I guess what I'm trying to say is this lack of really great male protagonists in horror is a representation of what's happening in society, where there's a lack of great male leaders in a lot of different spaces. And instead they're being replaced with leaders that are not helping our society. They're dividing our society and making lives for men and women way worse. Because no, you're not made up of feminine and masculine traits. And no, you don't have to behave a certain way to be masculine or to be feminine. It's actually ridiculous. And I think that's what drew me to horror in the first place. I've kind of talked about this before, but just like the feeling of fear is so universal to every person, it kind of makes us all on the same level playing ground. And especially with gore and stuff, it just really shows that we are literally all the same. And I really liked that, especially because I grew up in a society where men and women had very different jobs and you were forced into very specific roles. And it's been very weird to like have moved away from that and then see it slowly kind of following me and creeping up into my day-to-day life. And it's just strange. So that's all I have to say today. I don't have the answers. I guess I just wanted to say this because I think that the foundations of the horror community and like what makes it so strong and so prevalent now was built off of the collection of narratives of a lot of different people. That's all I have to say today. I just thought it was an interesting way for me to chime in on what is happening in our culture and how you're not going crazy for thinking that things are really tense, because you can see it manifested in horror movies specifically. In theory, we should have a lot of the things and they lives. We should have a lot of those coming out, but we do not. So you're not crazy for thinking that things are really weird and people are really going after the wrong things because they're not expressing themselves in a way that would show up in art, like films and horror. If you stuck around till the end, thank you for watching my video essay. I don't have all the answers. I don't have a degree in anything relating to this, so I'm probably wrong on a lot of different things, and feel free to tell me your opinion. Thank you for watching, and thank you for around 3K subscribers. That is very, very nice, and I will cry. I'm just happy that it's worthwhile that I talk about stuff like horror movies, because I love media analysis. That's literally one of my top 5 favorite activities, is to do media analysis. So thank you for giving me a tiny platform to be able to do that and to feel like I'm not talking into the void. Very much appreciate it. Okay, peace and love, and have a good night or a good day.